When the name Caligula, Gaius Caesar Germanicus, comes up, well, uh, the historical record tends to hand us a pretty specific image, doesn't
It
it?
really does. Tyranny, cruelty, just outright madness. That's the package deal we usually get.
Yeah, you instantly think of the really sensational stuff. Making his horse incitatus a consul.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
the classic.
Or ordering soldiers to collect seashells on the British coast as, war trophies. These stories are lurid, they're memorable.
But maybe too memorable. Have they kind of locked us into one way of seeing him?
I think that's exactly right. That sensationalism, it's shaped our view for centuries. He became this literary prototype almost of the bad emperor.
The absolute worst example.
Precisely. But just sticking with that moral judgment, it stops us asking, well, a crucial political question, was there maybe some kind of method behind all that apparent madness?
And that is the core mission for us today in this deep dive. We're going to try and set aside the usual moral judgments, the crazy anecdotes, at least for a bit.
And instead,
We're applying a different lens. A modern conceptual one, actually, from a pretty recent political science dissertation from 2025. It's called autocratic leadership.
Autocratic leadership.
Okay. The idea is to use this concept to understand why Caligula might have acted the way he did, and maybe more importantly, what his behavior tells us about the really shaky foundations of the early Roman Principate.
Okay, so before we dive into Caligula himself, we probably need to unpack that term. Adhocracy. What does it actually mean in this context?
Good point. So adhocracy, it's usually a term you hear for like modern organizations, right? Startups, maybe creative agencies.
Yeah, the places that need to be nimble, flexible.
Exactly. It's characterized by flexibility, by rapid improvisation. Decision-making isn't formalized, not locked into strict rules.
So no rigid bureaucracy, the leader kind of makes it up as they go along?
Sort of, yeah. They adapt the structure, the processes, even the rules themselves, based on how they see the immediate needs, the circumstances right then and there.
It's improvisational leadership, basically.
Yeah.
Pretty much the opposite of the stable, predictable, consensus-driven system that, Augustus supposedly put in place. Or at least that's the image.
So if we apply that framework to Caligula, what's the argument?
The argument is, well, it's pretty revolutionary, actually. What if his actions, the ones that seem totally random, chaotic, even destructive, what if they weren't just madness?
What if they were a kind of improvised political style, a strategy?
Exactly. A radical strategy maybe designed to consolidate power really quickly and just survive in a very dangerous political environment where the actual rules of being emperor, well, they weren't really written down yet. They were still being figured out, contested.
That's a huge reframing. Instead of his mad Caligula, we're looking at Caligula, the political improviser.
Right. Does it hold up? That's what we need to explore.
Okay, so before we even get to his actions and whether they fit this autocracy model, we absolutely have to talk about the sources. Where does our image of Caligula actually come from?
Yeah, that's crucial, isn't it? Because the Caligula we think we know is largely, well, a literary creation.
Almost entirely. The main accounts we have: Philo, Seneca, Josephus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius. They were all written after his assassination in 41 CE.
So hindsight is definitely a factor.
A massive factor. And it wasn't neutral hindsight. These guys were writing almost universally from a hostile perspective.
I remember that famous line from Tacitus about historians writing under the irritation of a recent hatred. That feels very relevant here.
Extremely relevant. These writers, they were products of their time, steeped in Greek rhetorical traditions, especially the tradition of invective.
Invective meaning like a formal attack, a character assassination.
Exactly. Their goal wasn't necessarily objective history as we'd think of it today. It was often about moral judgment, passing sentence.
So they'd focus on the juicy stuff.
They focused relentlessly on what they called noteworthy actions. And noteworthy often meant excessive, lurid, scandalous, because that kind of stuff delivered the strongest moral condemnation. It made for a better story, a clearer villain.
Which fits perfectly if you need to make Caligula look bad for political reasons.
Precisely. And there was a huge political need to demonize him. Think about his successor, Claudius. He comes to power right after Caligula's murder. He desperately needs stability, legitimacy.
So making Caligula look like a monster helps him how?
It allows Claudius and the Senate to frame Caligula as an exceptional aberration, just a one-off
completely unhinged madman.
Not a product of the system itself.
Exactly. If Caligula was just uniquely crazy, then his assassination wasn't a fundamental critique of the whole imperial setup that Augustus had designed. It was just, removing a dangerous anomaly. Problem solved, system's fine, let's move on with Claudius.
That's a really clever bit of political maneuvering through narrative control. You mentioned the Romans had a term for this, Doppelbödigkeit.
Yeah, doublespeak, essentially. Talking the talk of republican virtue, tradition, stability, while living the reality of autocratic power. Caligula had to be the villain, so the imperial system itself could be presented as fundamentally sound, just temporarily derailed by a lunatic.
It makes you question everything you read, doesn't it?
It should. And the sources themselves, sometimes they almost give the game away. Look at Suetonius, who gives us some of the wildest, most detailed stories of cruelty.
The real gossip columnist of the ancient world.
Yeah, pretty much. He actually admits sometimes that he's relying on secondhand stories. Anecdotes his own grandfather supposedly heard from courtiers who were there. Hearsay, basically.
But at the same time, these historians were often quite skeptical of official documents, weren't they?
They were. They often viewed official records, edicts, things like that, as potentially compromised, maybe forced by the emperor, not reflecting reality. So weirdly, the gossip, the rumors, sometimes seemed more trustworthy to them than the state's own paperwork.
Which leads to a history heavy on personal failings, moral outrage,
and light on actual political analysis of why things might have happened. It's all about Caligula the monster, not Caligula the political actor within a specific, very difficult context. Spinoza, centuries later, was astonished that supposedly intelligent men believed some of the trifles written about him.
Okay, but that raises a challenge for this adhocracy idea, doesn't it? If the sources are so focused on personal moral failings, lurid details, maybe even inventions, how can we possibly separate potential political strategy from genuine incompetence or maybe just pure sadism?
That's the million-dollar question, absolutely.
I mean, does the chaos always have to be intentional or strategic?
Yeah.
Can it just be chaos?
It absolutely can be. And that's why the adhocracy framework is useful, but not, a magic bullet. We aren't arguing Caligula was some kind of Machiavellian genius orchestrating everything perfectly.
Okay, so what are we arguing?
We're arguing that his choices, however destructive or bizarre they seem to us, might have been pragmatic responses, or what he perceived as pragmatic responses to the immediate political pressures he faced. The system was unstable. The transition from republic to empire wasn't smooth. It was messy, contested, non-formalized.
So radical actions might have felt like the quickest way to establish dominance.
Possibly, or the only way he knew how. The framework encourages us to look at his acts not just as random cruelty or madness, but potentially as a leader, improvising new rules, new methods to maintain control when the old rules, the old structures, clearly weren't working or weren't sufficient for the kind of absolute power he seemed to crave.
Okay, so we need to look at his actions now through that lens. Improvisation, flexibility, responding to immediate needs, even if the response looks totally off the wall to us.
Exactly. Let's start with where his power actually came from, his foundation.
Right, so if Caligula's rule was about improvisation, what was the bedrock? What was the non-negotiable source of his legitimacy? It seems like it all came down to his family, his lineage.
Absolutely fundamental. You cannot understand Caligula without understanding his pedigree. He was, crucially, the last living male link to the Julian line, the direct descendant.
The great-grandchild, the pronepos, as they said, of the divine Augustus himself?
Exactly. And in a system still figuring itself out, that lineage was probably his single greatest asset. No one else could claim that direct connection. And he knew it. He promoted it relentlessly.
It wasn't just Augustus, though, was it? His parents were also key figures in the public imagination.
Hugely important. His father, Germanicus, he had this soaring posthumous reputation. A beloved general, popular, seen as tragically heroic. Died young, possibly poisoned on Tiberius's orders, or so the rumors went.
Creating this aura of martyrdom almost.
Definitely. And his mother, Agrippina the Elder, she wasn't just anyone. She was the granddaughter of Augustus through his daughter Julia. So double lineage, really. Strong, respected figure in her own right, though she also fell foul of Tiberius.
So Caligula inherits this incredibly potent, almost mythic family background. How did he use it?
He weaponized it through propaganda, especially visual propaganda. He worked hard to create this image of the Domus Divina, the divine household. His family wasn't just noble, it was practically sacred.
And we can see this on the coins, right?
Oh, absolutely. The coinage is stunning evidence. Really tactical use of family imagery. He issued coins showing his father, Germanicus, in a triumphal chariot. Instant connection to military glory, Roman tradition.
Standard enough for an emperor, maybe.
Yeah.
But what about his mother? That was unusual, wasn't it?
Highly unusual. He honored Agrippina with a coin showing a carpentum. That's a special, ornate, covered carriage, usually reserved for imperial women, Vestal virgins, on very specific ceremonial occasions.
So putting her on a coin with her name.
It was unprecedented. Agrippina became the first woman, living or recently deceased, to be represented by name like that on central Roman coinage. He was elevating his immediate family parents, even his sisters later, to this quasi-divine status in the public eye.
So the message was clear. My rule isn't just legitimate, it's divinely ordained, historically inevitable because of who I am, who my family is.
Precisely. It's establishing a unique, superior status right from the start. This wasn't just a ruler, this was the heir.
Okay, so he has this amazing lineage, but the actual moment he takes power, after Tiberius dies in March 37 CE, that process itself seems like a prime example of adhocracy in action. It wasn't exactly smooth or by the book.
Not at all. It was, frankly, a shock to the system. The sequence of events is incredibly revealing.
What happened?
The Praetorian prefect, Macro, the commander of the emperor's personal guard, hailed Caligula as imperator. Military acclamation. But here's the kicker. This happened 2 full days before the Senate officially met to proclaim him Augustus and grant him all the traditional powers and titles.
Whoa. So the army basically chose him first.
That's exactly how it looked. The military, or at least the key military figure in Rome, made the initial decisive move. The Senate's role, when they did meet, felt much more like ratifying a decision that had already been made on the ground.
That sends a pretty chilling message to the old elite, the senators, that their traditional authority in selecting the leader is secondary.
At best, it solidified a new reality. Military backing, especially from the Praetorians in Rome, was paramount.
And then you get the Senate's reaction, which, in your analysis based on that dissertation, you interpret as their own kind of desperate autocratic gamble.
Yeah, it's a fascinating interpretation, because what did the Senate do? They didn't try to limit him or impose conditions. Instead, they went all in. They granted Caligula everything, all authority, all powers, in one single comprehensive package right at the very beginning.
Why? Why would they do that? It seems counterintuitive if they were worried about this young, inexperienced emperor backed by the military.
The theory is it was a calculated risk, a gamble. These senators, remember, they were experienced political operators. They had survived Tiberius. They knew the game.
So what was the calculation?
Maybe they thought, okay, this kid is young, maybe unstable. He's got this immense family legacy, but no real experience. By granting him absolute unlimited power immediately, the full potestas, the imperium, everything, maybe they hoped he'd just implode.
Overwhelm him. Hope he'd make huge mistakes really quickly.
Exactly. Make disastrous errors, alienate key groups, maybe even collapse under the sheer weight of that instant total responsibility. And then, who would be there to pick up the pieces?
The Senate. Ready to step back in as the stabilizing force, the guardians of tradition.
That seems to be the interpretation. A kind of autocratic move from their side-breaking precedent by granting everything at once, hoping for a quick failure they could exploit.
But it backfired. Spectacularly. Caligula took the power they handed him and ran with it.
He absolutely did. He used that very authority they'd granted him to immediately dismantle any potential checks or balances, any hint of shared rule.
How did he do that? What were the first moves?
Very calculated. First, he dealt with Tiberius's will. Tiberius had actually named a co-heir alongside Caligula, his own grandson, Tiberius Gemellus.
Right, so there's supposed to be a joint emperorship.
Potentially. But Caligula wasn't having any of it. He had the will annulled, just declared invalid.
On what grounds?
The justification was flimsy, but politically useful. He argued it had been signed and witnessed by people of the lowest condition, basically saying the document itself lacked the proper dignity for an imperial testament. Technicality, maybe, but effective.
And Gemellus, the co-heir.
He didn't last long. Caligula forced him into suicide shortly after, removed the rival claimant completely,
Growthless.
and politically decisive. By getting rid of the will and Gemellus, Caligula ensured his claim to power rested only on one thing: his position as the undisputed head of the imperial family, his divine lineage. Not on Tiberius's designation, not on the Senate's approval, which came after the fact anyway, just pure hereditary entitlement.
So he improvised a new basis for emperorship on the spot. No co-heirs, no ambiguity. Just him.
Exactly. Decisive autocracy. making new rules, simpler rules, based purely on his perceived superior status and the immediate need to eliminate rivals. The Senate's gamble had failed. He had taken their grant of total power and used it to make himself even more absolute. So Caligula's in power, he's used his lineage, he's sidelined the Senate in the succession, but it wasn't going to be smooth sailing. He inevitably ran into resistance from the very elite he'd bypassed, the ones who had maybe hoped he'd fail.
Right, the senators, the established families, they weren't just going to roll over.
Not at all, and this seems to come to a head around 39 CE. We hear about a conspiracy or perhaps multiple plots involving the protoi. These are the leading men, the most influential figures in Rome. People like Seneca, apparently, were implicated early on, though he survived.
So this wasn't just quiet grumbling anymore. This was active opposition, a real break.
It seems like it. The sources talk about a caesura, a decisive split in relations between Caligula and the Senate around this time. He apparently realized they weren't just going to be a compliant advisory body, they could be a source of real danger.
Okay, so how does an autocratic leader, someone improvising power, respond to a threat from the established, powerful elite who know all the old rules of the game?
He doesn't play by the old rules. He attacks them directly, using the very power they'd confirmed. He essentially launched a full frontal assault on the Senate.
How? What did that look like?
He started by calling out their hypocrisy, attacking their Doppelbödigkeit, their doublespeak, denouncing them for pretending to uphold Republican ideals while actually operating within and benefiting from this autocratic system he now headed.
Turning their own rhetoric against them.
Yeah.
Clever, but dangerous.
Very dangerous. And then he brought back the hammer, the Maestus trials, treason trials.
Ah, yes. We remember those causing a lot of fear under Tiberius. How did Caligula use them differently? Was it more autocratic?
I think you could argue it was. Tiberius, while he certainly used Maestus trials, often seemed, or at least presented himself as, reluctant. There was often a process, specific charges. Caligula seems to have weaponized them much more broadly, arbitrarily, and instantaneously.
So less about specific acts of treason, more about loyalty to him personally.
Exactly. The definition of treason became incredibly fluid. It was essentially whatever the emperor decided it was, right then and there. A perceived slight, a wrong look, maybe even just being too popular or wealthy, anything could potentially be twisted into a capital offense. The threat wasn't based on clear legal precedent. It was constant, unpredictable, generalized.
Which forces the elite to constantly guess, to constantly improvise their own behavior just to stay safe.
Precisely. It creates an atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty and fear. Dio Cassius, again, writing later with bias, but capturing the feeling, quotes Caligula as basically adopting that old cynical, sullen attitude. Don't worry about what pleases them. Don't listen if they complain. Just look after your own pleasure and safety. Maybe even adding the famous line from the playwright Acicius. Let them hate, so long as they fear.
Odorant, dumb, metuant, chilling. That's the absolute rejection of consensus or shared governance. It's pure self-justifying power.
And it makes the traditional structure of Roman government, with the Senate as this supposedly respected advisory council, almost impossible to maintain. So Caligula had to improvise a new power structure around himself.
Okay, so if the Senate is now the enemy, or at least deeply untrustworthy, where does he find his advisors, his real team?
Yeah.
His concilium principus, the emperor's council.
He starts deliberately blurring the traditional lines of status and power. It's about creating a new center of gravity, focused entirely on him, drawing people in based on loyalty and proximity, not traditional rank.
How did he do that physically, architecturally?
One fascinating example is what he did with the Temple of Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, in the Forum. This was traditionally a site associated with the equites, the knights, the second tier of the Roman elite, below the senators.
Right.
Caligula apparently extended his palace complex right up to it, even using the temple itself as a kind of vestibule, an entrance hall to his own residence.
Wow, so symbolically, he's absorbing this equestrian space into his personal domain.
Exactly. It visually and physically integrates non-senatorial groups directly into the heart of imperial power. It messes with the traditional hierarchy, forcing senators who might have business at the palace to literally rub shoulders with equestrians in a space that now belongs to the emperor. It's a visual statement about who really matters.
And in terms of the actual people he relied on, his inner circle.
It seems he increasingly bypassed the senators and relied heavily on trusted intimates, people whose loyalty was primarily to him, not to the state or the Senate. And crucially, this included lower status individuals, particularly his own freedmen, former slaves, the liberty.
Freedmen in positions of real power. That would have horrified the traditional aristocracy.
Absolutely. But for an autocratic leader, it makes sense. Their status, their power, derived solely from the emperor's favor. They had no independent power base. Their loyalty was likely more reliable. This informal network, this kitchen cabinet, effectively gained huge political weight, undermining the Senate's formal advisory role.
That's structural autocracy right there, replacing formal structures with informal, personally loyal ones.
And perhaps the most terrifying example of this reliance on informal, low-status agents was a guy named Protogenes.
Protogenes. Who was he?
He wasn't a senator, not even an equestrian, likely a freedman, but he was known as an informer, a delator, someone who frequented the court, gathered information, whispered accusations, an agent provocateur.
A spy within the court, essentially.
Pretty much. And Suetonius tells this incredible, chilling story about him. He says Protogenes used to carry around 2 scrolls, 2 lists, apparently labeled sword and dagger.
Sword and dagger. What was on them?
According to the story, the names of all 600 senators. Constantly updated. These were the lists of people under suspicion, potential targets for Maestas charges.
Wait, so the threat wasn't just abstract. It was literally written down, carried around the palace by this informer, potentially shown to the emperor at any moment. A visible symbol that everyone was being watched.
That's the implication. A physical manifestation of the arbitrary, ever-present threat. Treason charges weren't necessarily based on evidence. They could be improvised daily based on the whispers of someone like Protogenes. That constant danger must have been palpable.
It turns everyday life at court into a minefield.
Completely. Even basic rituals became instruments of control. Take the morning salutation, the salutatio. This was the traditional duty where clients would greet their patrons. Senators and equestrians would greet the emperor.
Standard procedure.
But under Caligula, it apparently became fraught with peril. The risk of renuncio amicitia principi, the formal withdrawal, the cancellation of the emperor's friendship was ever present.
So if you showed up for the salutatio and Caligula ignored you, or didn't acknowledge you properly,
that could be it. Social death, political death, maybe even literal death followed. Just being near the emperor, trying to follow whatever improvised court protocol was in effect that day, was inherently hazardous. The elite were trapped in this high-stakes, constantly shifting game of survival, governed entirely by the emperor's whim, his needs, his moods. Pure adhocracy, creating instability to maintain control.
Okay, so we've seen Caligula using this autocratic-style improvisation, breaking norms, creating uncertainty to manage the internal threats from the Roman elite. But what about external legitimacy? An emperor, especially a young one, needs to look strong, competent, particularly in military matters. That was crucial for Roman audiences, right?
Absolutely crucial. Military success, or at least the appearance of it, was non-negotiable. And Caligula certainly seems to have understood this. He needed a campaign, a victory. Britain was the obvious target. Caesar had gone there. It was seen as the edge of the world. Conquering it would be a huge prestige boost.
So did he actually prepare seriously for an invasion of Britain? Or was it all just talk?
No, the preparations look surprisingly concrete and competent, actually. This wasn't just bluster. First, he took steps to secure the existing frontiers. Most notably, in Mauritania and North Africa, he had King Ptolemy executed and annexed the kingdom. That secured the western flank. Strategic thinking.
Okay. And the logistics for Britain itself?
Significant. He raised 2 entirely new legions, Legio XV Primigenia and Legio XI Sectant Primigenia. That's a massive undertaking, costly, requires organization.
And we have physical evidence for this buildup.
We do. Archaeology backs it up. We find concentrations of coin hoards from his reign, wine barrels stamped with his name, things like that, clustered in the military camps along the Rhine frontier, the Limes. He was clearly massing troops there, likely as the staging ground for the jump across the channel. The logistical effort looks real.
So he's raising troops, gathering supplies. What about the commanders? Did he ensure discipline?
Seems so. He reportedly purged some older centurions, maybe seen as too set in their ways or not enthusiastic enough. And crucially, he replaced the existing commander on the Rhine, Gaetulicus, who might have been getting too powerful and independent.
Who did he replace him with?
With Servius Sulpicius Galba, the very same Galba, who would later become emperor himself after Nero. Galba had a reputation for being a strict disciplinarian, really rigorous.
So bringing in a tough guy to whip the legions into shape before the big campaign.
Exactly. There's even a story that Galba cracked down on excessive applause from the troops during military exercises and tightened the purse strings, apparently reducing the expected bonus for retiring veterans, getting the army lean and mean, ready for action.
Okay, this all sounds surprisingly normal. Strategic, competent military preparation. Not mad at all.
Right. It looks like he's ticking all the boxes for a standard imperial military operation.
And then we get to the coast,
Hmm.
and the infamous order to collect seashells, conscious. It just completely shatters that image of competence, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This is the story everyone remembers, the great farce.
It is, and it's where I think the military adhocracy shifts from preparation to pure manipulation of reality. It becomes this bizarre exercise in Doppelbödigkeit, making people accept something absurd as meaningful.
What exactly were the conscious? Is it definitely seashells?
Well, that's the traditional translation and the most common interpretation. Suetonius uses the word conscious, but people have debated it. Could it have meant something else? Maybe some kind of soldier's slang for something else, like sappers' huts. Musculi could mean muscles, but also huts. Or maybe symbolic items like collecting enemy helmets or shields after a battle. Or even, as some suggest, just a vulgar insult to the troops.
But whatever they literally were, the act of ordering soldiers to gather them as spoils of the ocean. That's the core of
That's the core. He commanded the legions, these tough Roman soldiers, to perform this completely meaningless, arguably humiliating task, and treat it as if it were a genuine military victory, collecting loot from Neptune himself.
What possible political gain could there be in that? Making your own army do something so ridiculous, it seems like it would just breed contempt.
Or it breeds absolute obedience. Think about it from the autocratic perspective. What's the gain? It's absolute control over the narrative, over reality itself. By forcing the soldiers, and later the Senate, to accept this absurdity as a legitimate military accomplishment, Caligula is testing the absolute limits of his authority. Can he make them believe, or at least pretend to believe, anything he says?
So it's a loyalty test, a power play.
Potentially. He declared victory over the ocean, marched the troops back, presumably with their seashells or whatever they were, and then held an ovatio in Rome in August of 40 CE.
An ovatio. That's like triumph flight.
Right.
Less prestigious than a full triumph.
Exactly. A lesser celebration, but still a formal recognition of military success.
Right.
And he holds this for his victory over the sea.
And the Senate. How did they react when presented with this achievement?
They were caught, completely trapped. They knew it was ridiculous, maybe even insulting. But how could they react?
If they praised it, they looked like fools or sycophants.
Right. But if they criticized it, or even just looked skeptical.
Treason. Maestas. Accused of mocking the emperor's glory, insulting the legion's efforts.
Precisely the dilemma. Their reluctance to openly challenge or ridicule the emperor, no matter how absurd his actions, forced them to basically go along with it, to reluctantly accept this fictional victory.
And in doing so,
They become complicit. They become co-responsible for his improvised, often nonsensical rule. By accepting the emperor's manufactured reality, the Senate validates it, at least publicly. That's the ultimate function of Doppelbödigkeit in this autocratic system, forcing the establishment to pretend the emperor's absurdity is normal, thereby confirming his power to define normality itself.
okay, if the seashells were the sort of absurd anticlimax of the military venture, then the Bridge of Baiae has to be the absolute peak of pure spectacle, right? This massive temporary bridge built across the Bay of Naples.
Oh, absolutely. Theater on an unbelievable scale. We're talking about a pontoon bridge made of anchored merchant ships lashed together, stretching for about 5.2 kilometers, that's over 3 miles, across the Gulf of Baiae near Naples.
Just why? That was the point of building this incredible temporary structure. The interpretations seem all over the place.
They really are. Was it some kind of military exercise? A practice run for crossing a channel, maybe linked to the Britain campaign? A symbolic crossing of water, like Xerxes crossing the Hellespont, showing dominion over nature?
Or was it something more personal, more tied to Caligula's psychology?
That's the other main line of interpretation, fueled by Suetonius again. He links it to a supposed prophecy made years earlier by Tiberius's court astrologer, Thrasyllus.
What was the prophecy?
Allegedly, Thrasyllus told Tiberius that Caligula had about as much chance of becoming emperor as he did of riding a horse across the Gulf of Baiae.
So Caligula builds the bridge specifically to literally fulfill, or rather defy, that prophecy, to prove the astrologer wrong and assert his destiny.
That's the story. It makes it an act of supreme arrogance, perhaps, or maybe deep insecurity. A way of saying, see, I achieved the impossible, therefore my rule is legitimate, fated.
Regardless of the exact mode of military practice defying prophecy, pure showing off the visual impact must have been staggering.
Unimaginable. It was a statement. a highly personal claim to extraordinary power, asserting dominion over nature, over fate, over logistics. Just the sheer scale of commandeering that many ships, organizing the construction, it was a demonstration of absolute will.
And the spectacle itself. What happened on the bridge?
It apparently lasted for 2 days. Caligula put on a show. There were military parades across the bridge, including, significantly, soldiers who had presumably been part of the seashell collection on the northern coast.
Ah, so connecting the absurdity in the north with this grand spectacle in the south.
It seems like it. Weaving it all into one narrative of his unique power. And Caligula himself was the star, of course. He rode back and forth across the bridge, apparently on his horse Incitatus.
The future consul.
Perhaps. And Suetonius adds another detail. Caligula supposedly wore the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he'd allegedly taken from Alexander's tomb in Egypt.
Seriously, Alexander's actual breastplate. Whether true or not, the symbolism is potent.
Incredibly potent. By dressing as Alexander, the ultimate conqueror, while literally riding over the sea on this impossible bridge, he's projecting an image far beyond a normal Roman emperor or general. He's associating himself with legendary, almost superhuman figures.
It's pure visual adhocracy, isn't it? He's not relying on tradition or precedent. He's inventing a completely new, grandiose theatrical mechanism to define and assert his own unique, supreme status. Authority through overwhelming spectacle.
Precisely. Making reality conform to his will and making sure everyone saw it.
That idea of unique, supreme, almost superhuman status, it leads us directly to what was probably Caligula's most radical and controversial move, the one that really cemented his reputation for madness in many ancient eyes, claiming divinity while he was still alive.
Yes, this was a fundamental break with Roman tradition. Augustus, his great-grandfather, had been cautious. He accepted divine honors, associated himself with gods, but the formal title divus, the deified one, was granted only after death by the Senate.
Right. Becoming a god was a posthumous reward for good service to the state, essentially.
Exactly. But Caligula didn't wait. He bypassed that process entirely. He started demanding recognition as a living god, a deus presens, a god right here, right now.
Which must have been deeply shocking to the traditional Roman mindset. But from the autocratic perspective you've been outlining, does it make a weird kind of sense?
It actually does, in a chillingly logical way, if you accept the premise he'd already established, his unique, inherited superior status based on that divine Julian lineage.
How so?
If his family, the Domus Divina, was already inherently semi-divine, if his connection to Augustus made him fundamentally different, then it wasn't his own divinity, just the natural, inevitable consequence. He wasn't asking for an honor to be granted. He was stating what he saw as a fact derived from his birthright. It's the ultimate expression of that hereditary entitlement he emphasized from day one.
So his claimed divinity wasn't an earned status, but an inherent quality of his being flowing from his ancestors.
That seems to be the implication. And he used his family, particularly his female relatives, in really innovative, unprecedented ways to reinforce this idea.
We mentioned the coins for his mother. What else did he do?
The most striking example is his sister, Drusilla. He was famously close to her, scandalously close, according to the hostile sources. When she died, he didn't just mourn her, he had her formally deified by the Senate. Diva Drusilla.
Deifying a woman, his sister. Was that normal?
Not at all. It was radical. And he went further. He publicly associated the deified Drusilla with major goddesses, particularly Venus Genetrix, Venus the Ancestress, the mythical founder of the Julian line itself.
So he's weaving his recently deceased sister directly into the foundational mythology of his dynasty.
Exactly. It wasn't just personal grief. It was a calculated political act. It reinforced the idea of the entire immediate imperial family as a sacred entity, a domus divina. He even included his living sisters in the annual public vows taken for the well-being of the emperor and the state, something completely unheard of.
Placing women, his sisters, into these traditionally male, state-sponsored religious formula. That's a significant autocratic disruption of established norms.
It absolutely is. He's rewriting the rules of Roman religion and public ritual on the fly to center his family, and therefore himself, as uniquely divine.
Okay, but claiming to be a living god within the Roman context, however shocking, is one thing. Trying to impose that claim on peoples with very different religious traditions, that's where things got really explosive, didn't they? Leading to the Jerusalem conflict.
Yes. This is probably the single incident, apart from the assassination itself, that most damaged Caligula's reputation in certain crucial historical sources, particularly non-Roman ones like Philo of Alexandria.
Philo, the Jewish philosopher and community leader, he was actually there, wasn't he? He led a delegation to Rome to plead with Caligula.
He was. And his account is harrowing. The crisis erupted when news reached Judea that Caligula had ordered a colossal statue of himself, depicted as Jupiter, to be erected.
Not just anywhere, but in the temple in Jerusalem.
In the Holy of Holies itself, the absolute sacred center of Jewish worship.
For the Jewish people, that wasn't just disrespectful. It was the ultimate blasphemy.
The ultimate profanation. It threatened the very core of their religious identity, their monotheism, their exclusive covenant with God. Allowing an idol, especially one representing a pagan god embodying the emperor, into the temple's most sacred space was simply unthinkable. It violated every principle of their law.
But from Caligula's perspective, or maybe a standard Roman perspective, raising statues to the emperor, even in temples, was kind of normal, part of demonstrating loyalty.
To a degree, yes. Within the polytheistic Roman world, adding another divine figure, even the emperor, to a local pantheon wasn't necessarily a crisis. It was often seen as business as usual, a political act of deference. They fundamentally misunderstood, or perhaps Caligula deliberately ignored, the unique theological position of Jewish monotheism.
So you have this massive cultural and religious clash brewing. What happened when Philo and the delegation met Caligula?
Philo describes the meeting as terrifying and almost farcical. Caligula apparently received them while inspecting one of his building projects, wandering around giving orders, and occasionally throwing questions at them. He seemed unable to grasp why they wouldn't worship him like other subject peoples.
Did he say anything specific about their refusal?
Philo reports Caligula mockingly calling the Jews God-haters or atheists because they refused to acknowledge his divinity, a divinity that all the other nations had accepted. It shows this collision perfectly. Caligula's autocratic insistence on universal recognition of his self-proclaimed status clashes head-on with the Jews' non-negotiable religious principles, principles that had, in fact, been historically granted exemptions by previous Roman rulers, including Augustus.
So Caligula was trying to override those traditional exemptions with his new universal claim.
It seems so. His improvised rule demanded universal compliance. Specific, long-standing local rights were an obstacle to that totalizing vision.
This sounds like it could have led to massive bloodshed.
Yeah.
Open revolt in Judea. How was it averted?
It was averted, but only just. Several factors played a role. Firstly, the Roman governor of Syria at the time, Petronius, seems to have understood the gravity of the situation on the ground far better than Caligula did in Rome.
Petronius was the one tasked with actually installing the statue, right?
He was. And he saw the massive peaceful protests by the Jewish population, who were essentially saying they would die rather than allow it. Petronius realized that forcing the issue would mean slaughtering thousands and triggering a full-scale rebellion, so he started stalling, playing for time, writing back to Rome, explaining the difficulties.
Buying time. Was there also diplomacy happening in Rome? You mentioned Agrippa earlier.
Yes, King Agrippa I. He was a Judean prince, Herod the Great's grandson, but he'd grown up in Rome, was personal friends with Caligula, and later became very close to Claudius. He seems to have used his personal influence with Caligula, apparently hosting a lavish banquet, and then pleading with him to rescind the order, or at least not enforce it immediately.
Did Caligula back down?
The accounts are a bit unclear on the exact sequence, but it seems Caligula eventually, grudgingly, relented on forcing the statue immediately, perhaps partly due to Agrippa's intervention and Petronius's warnings, but the underlying issue wasn't fully resolved until after Caligula's death.
Also,
one of Claudius's first acts as emperor was to issue a formal edict confirming Jewish rights and privileges throughout the empire, specifically forbidding the placement of imperial statues in synagogues. It implicitly recognized the unique status that Caligula had tried to trample.
So the resolution actually highlights the core problem. Caligula's universalizing improvised autocracy, crashing against established particular rights and traditions. His system couldn't accommodate exceptions.
Exactly. It shows the inherent instability and danger when that kind of flexible, leader-centric power ignores deeply held local norms and legally recognized privileges. The Jerusalem crisis is maybe the starkest example of the destructive potential of Caligula's specific brand of autocratic rule when applied outside the immediate context of Roman elite politics.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. His lineage and how he used it, the clash with the Senate, the Maestas trials, the reliance on freedmen, the military spectacle, the seashells, the Bridge of Baiae, the claim to divinity, the Jerusalem crisis. If we try and pull all these threads together now, looking through that lens of autocracy, what's the big picture? What's the central takeaway here about Caligula?
Well, I think the framework suggests that Caligula wasn't just acting randomly or out of pure malice, even if his actions were often cruel and destructive. He seems to have been operating exactly as that definition of adhocracy suggests, constantly improvising structures, rules, and justifications on the fly.
Why? To meet immediate needs.
To meet the immediate needs, as he perceived them, of surviving and dominating in a political system that was itself fundamentally unstable and in many ways undefined. He inherited this awkward transition, this halfway house between Republic and Empire left by Augustus and Tiberius. The old rules didn't quite apply, but the new rules weren't fully established.
So adhocracy, that flexibility, that willingness to break norms and invent new ways of doing things, was almost necessary, a required leadership style for that specific moment.
You could argue it was a response, perhaps even a logical one, to that environment. The extreme flexibility, replacing formal structures like the Senate's traditional role with informal ones like relying on freedmen or informers like protogenes, the constant use of spectacle to assert power, these were all attempts to impose a singular, decisive, personal control onto a system that lacked clear, agreed-upon mechanisms for imperial authority.
So the conclusion isn't necessarily that he was sane in our modern clinical sense, but that his madness had a political logic, a strategic dimension, even if it was ultimately self-destructive.
Exactly. Maybe the problem wasn't that he was simply mad, but that he was, as the dissertation suggested, guilty of playing the wrong role for the wrong people. He misjudged his audience, perhaps.
What do you mean by that?
The Roman elite, the senators he clashed with, they could perhaps tolerate the reality of autocracy, but they desperately wanted the forms, the outward appearances of the old republic to be respected. They needed the doublespeak, the Doppelbödigkeit, to maintain their own status and dignity.
And Caligula just shattered the facade.
He shattered it completely. He rubbed their faces in the reality of his absolute arbitrary power. He transgressed their expectations, their norms, too quickly, too dramatically, too openly. He refused to play the game by the unspoken rules.
Which made him intolerable to them.
And made him the perfect scapegoat, the perfect prototype of the bad emperor for later historians, Seneca, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, who were often writing for that same elite audience, or under emperors who needed to contrast themselves with a monstrous predecessor. He became the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when an emperor goes too far, ensuring that the system itself wasn't blamed.
It sounds like his adhocracy was maybe effective in the short term for consolidating power and intimidating rivals.
Yes, you could say that. He used cruelty, absurdity, divine claims as instruments of immediate improvised power, and it seems to have worked for a while in keeping the elite off balance.
But he couldn't sustain it.
He couldn't seem to transition. Adhocracy might be useful for disruption, for tearing down old structures, maybe even for crisis management, but he never managed to move beyond that radical, destructive phase to build something stable. He just kept improvising, kept generating chaos, kept alienating powerful groups, until eventually
They killed him. The Praetorian Guard, the very group that first acclaimed him emperor, assassinated him after less than 4 years.
the ultimate failure of his autocratic approach. It generated too much friction, too much fear, and ultimately fatal opposition.
Which brings us, I think, to a really interesting and maybe unsettling final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder after this deep dive. If adhocracy, this flexible, improvisational leadership style, means making up the rules based purely on the leader's perception of immediate needs, is there actually a clear line where that stops being adaptable leadership and just becomes tyranny?
Where does necessary flexibility end and arbitrary destructive power begin? It's a blurry line.
And maybe think about it in today's world, too. Can you see echoes of this? What modern leaders, perhaps those who rely heavily on spectacle, on bypassing formal institutions, on the power of personal loyalty and proximity, and who seem to constantly shift norms and expectations, could they potentially be analyzed more effectively or perhaps more worryingly through this ancient autocratic lens?
It's definitely food for thought. When does improvisation become indistinguishable from abuse of power?
Something to consider.